Your boss can fire you. 100 years ago, your boss could have you shot. And it happened. Not in some distant dictatorship. Not in a war zone. In American towns with train stations, churches, and schoolhouses, where the people doing the work were treated like the enemy. And here's the part that should scare you. Most of the time, the men holding the guns weren't criminals. They were paid, authorized, sometimes even called law. By the end of this video, you'll know why US towns once looked like war zones over something as simple as asking for a raise. This is the story of the labor wars, when workers fought for basics we take for granted, and the price was paid in blood. Picture your life in a coal town. In the early 1900s, you wake up in a house owned by the company. You walk to a mine owned by the company. And when you get paid, it isn't even real money. It's Scrip, company-issued currency that only works at one place, the company store. So food comes from the company. Clothes come from the company. Tools come from the company. And the prices are not market prices. They are whatever the company decides. If you run out before payday, they'll help you by lending you more Scrip, which you pay back by working more. So you're always behind, always owing, always trapped. Now add the mine itself. Coal mining was brutally dangerous collapses, explosions, suffocation, crushed limbs. And if you complain, you're not just fired. You're blacklisted, meaning no other company town nearby will hire you. So when workers start whispering one forbidden word, union, the company hears it like a threat. Because a union doesn't just mean higher pay. It means the company doesn't own your entire life anymore. And companies didn't give up that control peacefully. Here's how employers fought back. They didn't always rely on city police. They hired their own force. The most notorious name in that world was the Pinkerton Detective Agency. They weren't detectives in the movie sense. They were hired muscle agents, used to spy on unions, infiltrate meetings, and, when the time came, break strikes. And if that sounds dramatic, let's go to one of the most famous examples. Homestead, Pennsylvania, year 1892. Steelworkers at Carnegie's Homestead plant were locked out. The company wanted to cut wages and crush the union. So the manager, Henry Clay Frick, made a plan: bring in Pinkertons by river, quietly, like a military landing. Early morning, fog on the water. 2 barges drift toward the plant, but the workers are waiting. They've been watching the river all night, because in a labor war, you don't sleep, you listen. The Pinkertons try to step onto the shore, and then the shooting starts. A 12-hour gun battle. At least 10 people, dead workers and Pinkertons. And even after that, the company still wins the physical ground, because the state steps in, the National Guard arrives, and the strike collapses. So remember what just happened. A wage dispute turned into a battlefield. That is the pattern. And it repeats, in even uglier ways. Now we go to Colorado. 1914, Ludlow. Coal miners, many of them immigrants, strike against the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, tied to the Rockefeller family. They want safer mines, fair treatment, and recognition of their union. The company responds the way company towns always respond: eviction. Families are thrown out of company housing like trash on the curb. So the workers do the only thing they can do. They build a tent colony on open land near Ludlow, hundreds of families living under canvas. Think about that. Not just workers, wives, babies, kids living in tents through cold nights because they refuse to crawl back into the mine on the company's terms. Then comes the peacekeeping. The Colorado National Guard arrives. But many guardsmen are funded or supported by the company, and the relationship between the guard and the strikers collapses into open hostility. And now, it's April 20th, 1914, morning. Tension thick enough to choke on. A line of soldiers takes position, and then gunfire. Bullets rip through canvas. Families run. Parents grab children. People dig into the ground for safety. Some families had already dug pits beneath their tents, little holes to hide in when shooting started, because they knew this was possible. The shooting goes on for hours. And when evening comes, the camp catches fire. Tents burn fast. Canvas goes up like paper. The next day, rescuers lift debris and find one of those pits. Inside are bodies, women and children, who hid from bullets and then couldn't escape the flames. Accounts describe the Ludlow Massacre as a deadly labor conflict that killed men, women, and children in the tent colony. This is the moment where the story stops being history and becomes something else, a mirror, because the question becomes unavoidable. What kind of society allows a wage dispute to end with burned children? And if you think that kind of brutality would end the labor wars, it didn't. In some places, it escalated into something close to a civil war. West Virginia, coal country. By 1921, tension is boiling over. Miners want union recognition. They want an end to intimidation and violence. But the region is controlled by coal operators and their hired forces. And then miners decide enough. Thousands gather eventually, more than 10,000, and they start marching. Not for a symbolic protest. A march with rifles. Many wear red bandanas, which become a signature of these miners. They're not marching to make a point. They're marching to change who controls their lives. Across Blair Mountain, their opponents dig in. Lawmen, deputies, mine guards, armed and organized. Leading the defense is Sheriff Don Chafin, aligned with coal operators. Now, imagine the scene. A ridgeline, entrenched positions, the sound of gunfire echoing through mountains. The Battle of Blair Mountain lasts for days. It becomes the largest armed labor uprising in U.S. history. And then, the United States government steps in. Federal troops arrive. At that point, miners face a reality that's hard to beat. When the state chooses a side, it brings overwhelming force. The uprising collapses. Miners surrender. Arrests follow. So, again, workers fight. Workers bleed. Workers lose the immediate battle. And you might ask, if they lost so many times, how did anything change? That is where the next part matters. Violence wasn't the only weapon used against workers. Sometimes the government broke strikes with paper and then backed that paper with guns. Look at the Pullman Strike of year 1814. It began with railroad workers connected to the Pullman Company, and it spread into a nationwide rail boycott led by the American Railway Union. The federal government responded with a tool that would shape labor conflicts for years: the injunction. Courts ordered the strike and boycott to stop. When it didn't stop, President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops. The strike collapsed, and labor leader Eugene V. Debs was arrested after the injunction was enforced. This was the message: if you disrupt the economy, the state will treat you like a threat to the nation. So labor wars weren't just workers versus companies. They were workers versus a system that often backed property over people. And still, despite troops, injunctions, and massacres, workers kept organizing. Because the conditions weren't a little unfair. They were unlivable. Here's the turning point: public opinion. In story after story, Americans saw what order really meant. Children in ashes, families evicted into winter, gunfire over wages. When tragedies hit cities too, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, the shock helped fuel a wave of workplace safety reform, especially in New York, and became a symbol of how deadly bad conditions could be. Over time, pressure built toward national labor protections. Then, in 1935, Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act, the law that made it U.S. policy to protect workers' rights to organize and bargain collectively in the private sector. The National Archives notes it was signed into law on July 5, 1935. The key shift wasn't that companies suddenly grew a conscience. It was that the country finally admitted the obvious: when workers have no legal path to negotiate, conflict turns violent. So if modern work feels tense, if people feel disposable, underpaid, replaceable, remember this: a lot of what feels normal today only exists because workers in the past walked into situations where the cost of speaking up wasn't a bad performance review. It was a beating, a blacklist, a bullet, or a fire. Homestead showed what happens when corporations hire armies. Ludlow showed what happens when families become targets. Blair Mountain showed what happens when workers decide they'd rather fight than disappear. Most of them didn't get to enjoy the rights they fought for, but you do. And the people who paid the price weren't the executives. It was workers. Always workers. If you want more stories that show who really paid for the rights you have at work today, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button so this reaches more people, and share this video with someone who thinks labor history is just about dates in a textbook. Tell them it is about bullets, fires, and the fights that still shape their paycheck.